Welcome to History 111, Lecture 45, The New South. At the end of Reconstruction, power in the southern governments was consolidated in the hands of a small elite that critics referred to as Bourbons. Now, many were from a new ruling class of merchants and industrialists, but a few were from the old planter class. Now, they were corrupt and ran states in their own interests, and that was primarily to have low spending and low taxes. So they're going to further cut state programs and go so far as to declare that schools are not a necessity. Now, while there was some opposition to these governments, it was mostly based on changes to spending priorities. So the Bourbons are going to typically use racial prejudice to break resistance to their rule and stay in power. Now, it's around the same time that Southern society starts to reimagine what things had been before the war, and they come up with the lost cause idea. And they say that the old South had been an idyllic land of racial harmony brought on by slavery and cotton, ruled by chivalrous colonels and white suits. And they begin to engage in that fantasy, and they begin to say that this old South they were romanticizing and engaging in serious self-delusions about was something they could never come back to, and it was something that had no place in the world, that it was this great lost, almost Eden-like thing that had been corrupted, and now that it was lost and gone, that they could never go back to it, they had to use industry because Northern industry won the war. So as they put it, they now have to develop the South and industrialize to out-Yankee the Yankees. So the New South is going to begin a period of industrialization and establish some strong steel and textile industries, and the rail and transport industries are also going to see significant investment and development. But these industries are going to rely on cheap labor, and factory work in the South is mostly done by women. War casualties had left a large number of women unmarried and in need of employment, and the wages for women in the South were about half of that of the North. And factories also tended to establish towns around their mills in the South where they controlled rent and the stores, and in these places they sold goods at high prices and used credit given at huge interest rates. So in other words, they had simply come up with a way to exploit cheap labor in a new industrialized setting. Now, employment opportunities in manufacturing tended to favor whites, and employment for blacks tended to be restricted to low paid, menial, or dangerous tasks. In addition, in order to keep wages down, many states would rent out convicts, and these were not paid, but the state was paid for their use. Employers were also free to abuse prisoners, and many died as a result of the mistreatment that was happening there. Now, the institutional racism that was being developed and established with things like segregation in the South led to a lot of white merchants not wanting to do business with black people, and that allows for black merchants and bankers to establish themselves by catering to that community. Now, while that's going to build up a black middle class, it's never going to rival the white middle classes in the South. Now, some of these individuals are going to use trade and finance to make careers, but most of the black middle class were doctors, lawyers, and teachers who also tended to cater to the black community. Now, education and support from Northern Charities is going to help develop important schools and colleges that are going to help build, expand, and sustain that middle class. Now, with regards to education in the South, a very important individual is Booker T. Washington. He had been born a slave, became educated, and established the Tuskegee Institute, and he believed that a classical education would not serve the black population of the South. He felt that an industrial education would allow more blacks to enter middle class and establish successful businesses. He also felt the schools should instill values of thrift, cleanliness, clear speech, and tidy dress, because these were the values he saw in the white middle class, and he believed that would help them become successful. In other words, he felt that in the conditions of the South, learning Latin and Greek were all well and good, but learning things like plumbing, or how to be a better farmer, or how to run a business were things that people really needed. So he also felt controversially that racial equality was not the best course to pursue. He thought that if the black middle class could become strong enough, their economic power would create racial equality. In other words, in Booker T. Washington's mind, that no matter what the prejudices of the day are, when it comes right down to it, the only color Americans care about is green. So on the one hand, he was advocating systematic self-improvement and advancement for his community, but he's ultimately compromising on the idea of real equality in the short term because he believes that economic power will create it eventually. It's important to understand that any degree of equality that existed within the South after the Civil War only existed because of the presence of federal troops, but with the withdrawal of federal troops at the end of Reconstruction, equality goes with it. Now, while the 14th and 15th Amendment ensured that states could not discriminate, the Supreme Court ruled that private individuals could, and that allowed businesses to establish themselves as being white only. And the irony of this is that actually helped the black middle class expand because the black community still needed access to services and created a hole in the market and allowed for black people to go into business. There were a lot of key cases that supported what the South was doing. Plessy v. Ferguson came up with a doctrine called separate but equal, and this is a court case involving Louisiana's law segregating railroad cars. And they said it was legal so long as the railroad cars were equal, because equal treatment, according to the Supreme Court, meant equal rights this time. Now, the Supreme Court is going to eventually reverse itself and rule that separate is inherently unequal in the 1950s. There's also Cummings v. the Board of Ed, that's where de jure segregation is legal even when no separate facilities existed. And they decided that education was a state issue and not within the meaning of the 14th Amendment. So in other words, it was legal to have a whites-only school even when there was no black school. Under Plessy v. Ferguson, it was legal as long as there was a separate and equal facility. With Cummings v. Board of Ed, it's legal even if that separate facility doesn't exist. Now, in addition to Supreme Court cases and other things that are going to build up and strengthen the institutional racism of the South, the white governments are going to take one of two approaches to retaining control, depending on the strength of white opposition. Now, where significant white opposition exists, the ruling parties will attempt to use the black votes against their opponents. And where the opposition was not significant, they're going to attempt to disenfranchise the black population altogether. And they're going to do that through things like poll taxes, property requirements that are often going to bar poor whites from voting as well. And they're also going to use literacy tests. And those literacy tests often have grandfather clauses that allow illiterate whites to vote if their ancestors had done so before the war. So in other words, if you were descended from someone who had been a voter before the war, you continue to retain your rights no matter what. But if you had ancestors that could not vote before the war, you had to prove that you could read. And often enough, these literacy tests were things that set the bar so high that most people couldn't pass them and was simply an excuse to deprive people of their votes. Now, the Supreme Court is going to overturn the grandfather clauses but allow literacy tests in general. And the Supreme Court is going to show a general unwillingness to interfere with laws that could disenfranchise white people as well, even if that disenfranchisement was only theoretical. And disenfranchisement is going to allow for the rapid expansion of de jure or segregation under the law. The use of lynching is also going to be something that's used to prevent any effective agitation for equal rights. In short, a white mob is going to use fear, intimidation, and murder to ensure that segregation continues unopposed. So what's the big idea here? Well, first and foremost, there will be an attempt to reinvent the Southern economy. That's going to lead to the emergence of a new elite of merchants and industrialists, and they're going to use various tactics to gain and retain control. This would include things like institutional racism and disenfranchisement of the black population in the South. See you in History 112.